Last time we talked about marketing gains, we talked about strategic benefits. What was my example of strategic benefits? Does anyone remember? Yeah, so Procter & Gamble, what did they buy? Which company did they buy? Charmin, very good. And they used that to be able to expand into a whole lot of other projects. So that would be one of the reasons that you would undertake a merger is for strategic benefit. Now let's talk about market power. Market power. If I am the only person in a market providing a good or service, what do the prices look like? Yeah, they're high, right? Now I can't charge infinite amounts of money, people wouldn't buy it, but I can charge more than if I had competitors. So let's talk about some examples there. In Springfield, we've got lots of different gas stations. And as a result, the gas price from regular station to regular station, and I have to say that because Costco was like way cheap, but from just regular gas stations, you're going to see basically the same price everywhere. So that's what competition does for us, and that price is lower than it would have been otherwise. How many of you know about Brown Derby? Yeah, what business is Brown Derby in? Alcohol. It's a liquor store, right? By the way, did you know that Bass Pro Shop got started in the corner of a Brown Derby liquor store? That's like a Springfield story right there, right? Okay, so now Brown Derby liquor, you can't swing a dead cat in this town without hitting a Brown Derby liquor store. Have you ever noticed that? There will be like one, and then like 3 feet down the street, there's another one. Well, maybe 3 blocks. But the point here is we've got lots and lots of those. Now, the question is, why do you think that is? Do you think that they really need all of those stores? Are we really such alcoholics in this town that we have to have that many Brown Derbies? And the answer is no. And here's why we have so many Brown Derbies, at least back in the day, not so much lately, but back in the day. If someone would open a competing liquor store, they could charge less than Brown Derby and still make a healthy profit because Brown Derby was the only other game in town, right? And so what Brown Derby would do is they would go and they would buy out that liquor store and turn it into a Brown Derby. Now what happens to their pricing power again? Goes right back up. So that's market power. Now you can do that on a local basis. You can't so much do that on the national basis because the federal government will get after you. Let me give you one more example about market power. When I lived in Columbia is like halfway in between Kansas City and St. Louis. And Columbia has its own airport called the Columbia Regional Airport, which is CRAP for short. That's the acronym, CRAP. I usually get a laugh out of that, but apparently not today. Okay, so this is the kind of place where the planes that go in and out of there, they have like 6 seats and you have to hold a chicken on your lap. Nobody wants to fly out of Columbia. And so if you live in Columbia and you have to travel for business, you typically are choosing, am I going to go over here to Kansas City or if I'm going to go to St. Louis, because it's 2 hours either way. And so that's your deal. You got to travel 2 hours. Now here's the problem. If you're traveling for business, most of the time you're trying to get to the place in time to have meetings, which means that you have to fly in the morning. And you've got to be at the airport, let's say an hour beforehand, more likely 2. But, so that puts you back further, and then you've got this 2-hour trip, which means you're getting up at dark 30, right? And so you end up driving when human beings should not be driving. And so there were a couple of, let's call them hippies, in Columbia, and they had a van. Do you guys know about hippies and vans? Yeah. Okay, so these hippies had a van, and they had an idea. Well, hey, we're already up at that time. Why don't we just start driving people to the airport and charging them for it? And they go to Kansas City one day, and they go to St. Louis the next, and it really worked out well for them. And then they figured out that if they would get another van, they could double their revenue. And the company was called Tiger Express. And it grew and grew and grew. And it got to where, oh, by the way, employers would reimburse this because they're going to have to reimburse mileage for the people that drive anyway. And so all they had to do was keep their price below mileage and then whatever parking the people would have had to have paid at the airport. And so there's fat margins in this business. A group of outside businessmen came in And they saw this, just basically that, and these hippies were named Doc and Tom. And they just saw that Doc and Tom were printing money left and right. And they just, wow, that's a great business model. And so they offered to buy out Doc and Tom. And let's say, I don't know how much it was because it's a private transaction, but let's say it was $1 million. And so Doc and Tom, they're like, yeah, man, $1 million. And they take the money, right? Now, the other people take over Tiger Express, and let's say the ticket was $50. The ticket price stays $50. Now, where did the businessmen get the $1 million to give to Doc and Tom for the business? They borrowed it. And so they've got payments they've got to make, debt payments. Remember the disciplining effect of debt? They've got payments they've got to make. So this is an important business for them. Now, here's the bad thing. Doc and Tom took a little time off, and they went and toured Europe, spent some time in Amsterdam, and then they come back, and they're bored. And they're sitting around one day, and Doc says to Tom, hey man, are you bored too? And Tom says to Doc, yeah man. And then Doc says, I know, let's buy a van. Because these people had not made them sign a non-compete agreement. Do you guys know what a non-compete agreement is? It says that you won't do the same business within a certain amount of time, within a certain radius or whatever. They didn't have Doc and Tom sign that. And so Doc and Tom are sitting there on $1 million of capital, and they go out and they buy a van. And they call themselves MoX. And then, of course, they go out and buy another van and another van and another van, and they start advertising on TV, because after all, they're sitting on a boatload of cash. And they say, hey, we're back. I'm not kidding, that's the ad. We're back. And they're like, you know, it's the people you've always known. We just have a new name, MoX. And we're only going to charge $45 to take you to Columbia or Kansas City. What does Tiger Express now have to immediately do to their price? Yeah, they have to drop it. And so Doc and Tom see this, and the very next week they say, all right, man, $40. What does Tiger Express have to immediately do? Yeah, they've got to drop it too. Now, keep in mind, Tiger Express has got a boatload of debt that they've got to satisfy. Doc and Tom are sitting on a pile of cash. Do you think Doc and Tom can wait these guys out? Absolutely. And so basically what Doc and Tom did, and don't be confused and think that hippies aren't good business people. I mean, check out Burt's Bees, right? Okay, so back to the story. They basically make these people beg for mercy. And in the end, Tiger Express says to Doc and Tom, will you guys buy this business back, Tiger Express? And Doc and Tom's like, yeah, how much? And they say, $100,000. And Doc and Tom say, sold. Pay him the $100,000. Now, by this time, ticket prices are down to $35. Now there's only one company. What do you think happens to ticket prices the very next week? $50, man, right? That's market power. Now, people had been asking Doc and Tom to continue on over into Illinois to that Spirit whatever airport that's over there. And Doc and Tom always said no. Does anyone know why? It's across state lines, and that gets the feds involved, man. We don't want the feds knowing our business, right? And so this is how Doc and Tom managed to have this monopoly. It's the same way that Brown Derby used to operate in Springfield. Now there's some other options there, but it's market power, and it leads to abnormal profits. And so if you can make a merger that gives you additional market power, then you can make additional profits, and that would be another source of revenue enhancement from the merger. Does that make sense? Okay. Now let's talk about cost reduction. The one that we often hear about are economies of scale. And that's where we spread overhead over more units of production. So right now at the university, we're running into the opposite of economies of scale, because we've got fewer and fewer units of production, right? Student credit hours. We don't actually consider you guys products, but the hours we produce are the product. And so enrollment's down, so those hours are down. We've got diseconomies of scale. But what if we were able to take over Missouri Southern State University down in Joplin? We could spread, and by the way, what would we do with their president? Boop. What would we do with all of their overhead, right? It all goes away, and now Cliff is president over both of these institutions. And so we could spread Cliff's cost, and Frank's cost, and everybody else up there in Carrington Hall. We could spread their cost over more units of production. And so we see this in businesses too. When my old employer Halliburton bought Dresser, we shut down their corporate headquarters and sold it. And so then we're only supporting one corporate headquarters, we're only supporting one CEO, and you just keep going on down the list. Lots of things we didn't have to have two of anymore. And so that's economies of scale. And then there are economies of vertical integration. Do you remember when we talked about vertical acquisitions? Like for instance, Apple was buying that chip design company, and they're trying to basically, they're buying in at different levels of the same value chain. And there's more than just the ability to control the inputs. There are also economies to that. I'll give you an example. When so my operation in Dallas, Texas made safety valves that go down in oil wells. And I don't know if you know this, but stuff that goes in an oil well has a hole in the middle. Do you know what the hole's for? For the oil, right? Okay, so all the valves are basically start out as a piece of pipe, and a lot of the material that we would buy would come in with a hole already in it, but other stuff would come in as bar stock. In other words, we had to drill a hole. So the very first operation on a lot of things was to drill a hole. Now, the guy that controlled the drill, it wasn't in my group. It wasn't even in my business unit. It was in another business unit, and the guy that controlled the drill was my arch nemesis. I know it's hard to believe that I would have an arch nemesis, but I did. Okay, so he's my arch nemesis, and so whenever two orders showed up at the same time, even if mine had a closer due date, whose work got on the drill first, his or mine? Oh, come on, people are scumbags. What's your guess?
His.
Yeah, it was always his. And so what did I do? Well, I went out and bought an old turret lathe, which is basically a machine for making round stuff, and I set it up as a drill. It wasn't as fast as what he could do with his drill, but at least I controlled my own destiny. Now, where does the economies of that come in? Well, it turns out that being able to meet your promises to your customers has economic value. And as long as I was depending on him to drill my material, I would never be able to control my ability to meet the promises to my customers. Once I start controlling that for myself, now I can, or at least more so, right? Does that make sense? So that's economies of vertical integration. And then we have complementary resources. So this is where we make better use of existing resources. And our favorite example of this are the patio and the fireplace store. So imagine two stores on either side of Glenstone Avenue. One of them is a fireplace store. They sell stuff for fireplaces. And then the other one is a patio store. They sell patio furniture, barbecue grills, umbrellas, that sort of stuff. Now, in the wintertime, which one of these places gets a lot of business? Yeah, the fireplace store. But you get around to like May, June time, are people thinking about cozying up by the fire? No. What they're thinking about is being outside, cooking hot dogs, that sort of thing. And so they migrate over to the patio store. And so in the summertime, the fireplace person is looking across the street, seeing all those people at the patio store feeling bad, and it's exactly the opposite in the wintertime. What if these two organizations were to merge? What if we could have a store that sold fireplace stuff in the wintertime and patio stuff in the summertime? Those are complementary resources. We'd only have to have one building, right? And so it makes a lot of sense. And by the way, the customer base is probably the same, because the same kind of people that are spending money on this fireplace stuff are probably the same kind of people who have a patio where they might like to put a little dinette and an umbrella, that sort of thing. And so that is our regular example of complementary resources. But I want to give you some other ones. When I lived in Lafayette, Louisiana, and that's how you pronounce it, Lafayette. When I lived in Lafayette, Louisiana, there was a rink for ice skating, and we had our local semi-pro hockey team, the Ice Gators. If you say it real fast, it sounds like ice skaters. It's Cajun humor. I don't get it either. Okay, so they're the Ice Gators. But semi-pro hockey team only has a season. It doesn't last all year long. And so they also had an arena football team. You guys know what arena football is? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a smaller field. The players aren't as good. The cheerleaders aren't as attractive. But I knew one of them. Lovely person. Okay, so but this happens to happen opposite of the semi-pro hockey team season. And so you could have both of those teams utilize the same arena. And so that's a complementary resources story. Let me give you one more. When do people snow ski? In the wintertime. And so we've got all this infrastructure built. And I'll even draw you a picture here. So here we have a mountain. And so we got a ski lodge down here. And people go, and we got the ski lifts and whatnot to take people up the hill. And then they ski down and they sit in the chalet and drink cocoa and whatnot. What happens in the summertime? Not much, right? Nobody wants to go skiing in the summertime because there's no snow. Now, what could they do? Well, they could. There's flat land out here. Maybe they build a golf course. Maybe they get, I don't know who's designing golf courses these days. Back in the day, it would have been Arnold Palmer, but he's dead. You get someone to design, it happens to everyone. You get someone to design like one of these really high-end golf courses, and then what does that mean? It means in the warm weather, you can have golfers come, and where do they stay? Right? And so you can have your chalet occupied in both the summer and the winter. That would be another complementary resources story. Does that make sense? Okay. I think I've given you every example that I can think of that might show up on an exam. But, you're clever. You can figure out other examples on your own. Any questions? Okay. Let's talk about lower taxes. Remember, we have to, when we're trying to keep this from being a taxable acquisition, this can't be the only reason. It can't even be the primary reason for the acquisition. But it's definitely something we should consider. So we could talk about the use of tax losses. What if you've got one company that is really well ran and has high profits, and you've got another company that's been poorly ran and has been consistently losing money? That poorly ran company will have what are called tax loss carry forwards. Because when you make money, Uncle Sam makes you pay taxes. When you lose money, they're not going to send you a check, but they will allow you to count it against your future taxes. Now, if you continually stink and you never make a profit, you'll never get to take advantage of those tax losses. But what if another company comes in and buys your company? Then they could take advantage of those tax loss carry forwards to offset the taxes they're going to owe on their profitable business. Now, it won't work if this business continues to lose money, right? They're actually going to come in here and fix the business also, but it's just one more benefit is this ability to use those tax losses. Okay, now what about unused debt capacity? Let's talk about your credit card. Can you just go out and charge any amount you like on your credit card? No. It's got something called a limit on it, right? And with good reason. Now, what happens is as you prove yourself to be more and more reliable at paying, what happens to your credit limit? It goes up. Okay. Well, businesses, you can think of them similarly having a debt capacity. It's sort of like a credit limit, but it's not necessarily driven by banks or bondholders. It's driven by this trade-off between the tax shield of debt and the expected cost of bankruptcy. There we go. The expected cost of bankruptcy. And so they're always making this trade-off. And so let's assume that a company is balanced right now, trading off those two things. They basically used up their debt capacity. They can't take on any more debt. But what if you've got a company over here that is totally financed with equity, and they're in an industry where the typical firm is financed with 50% debt? What can you do? You can buy that business, and then you can issue debt and buy back half of those shares. And then now we have the tax shield of that debt to further reduce the taxes that we have to pay. And so that's what unused debt capacity is all about. You are buying a firm that is under-levered, meaning doesn't have enough or the amount of debt that it can have, and then we're basically levering it up so we can take advantage of that tax shield of debt. You may have actually seen this in your own lives. So let's assume that, and we'll make this person a man that has totally maxed out his credit cards. And he finds a woman who's financially responsible, and she's used very little of her debt. Is there an advantage to the man marrying the woman? Yeah. In addition to the fact she's financially responsible, she also, now he's got access to all this extra credit. Does that make sense? And so that's kind of what we're seeing here. By the way, marriages are a whole lot like mergers, and we'll get to more of that later. Okay, now we have an argument that might be okay, might be not. And that's the idea that we can use these surplus funds. By the way, who do surplus funds belong to? Do they belong to the CEO? No. They belong to the shareholders. And so if you've got surplus funds as a business, as a corporation, you should be doing one of a couple of things. Number one, you could be paying dividends. But we know that our shareholders are going to have to pay taxes on those dividends, most likely. And then you could be doing share repurchases, which is where we buy shares back from people. But if we buy shares back from people and they sell it back to us at a price higher than what they bought it, what kind of taxes are they going to incur? Yeah, capital gains taxes. And so either way, we're incurring a tax on the part of the investor. And so the argument goes like this. Well, hey, if I could just use that surplus cash to go out and buy another company, I'm not imposing taxes on my shareholders. It sounds like a good argument. In reality, if that's your only argument for making this acquisition, then it's a bad argument. Okay. And then there's the ability to write up the value of depreciable assets. If you remember purchase accounting, we said, oh, by the way, pooling of interest, we said that they just add the two balance sheets together, right? And so if something was on their balance sheet as 10,000, now it's on my balance sheet as 10,000. But under the purchase method of accounting, which is what we have to use now, we have to put it on our books at the fair market value. And the fair market value of these assets is often higher than the book value that they currently have. For example, when I took over my business in 1997, my book value of all my assets was 0 because they were so old. But I could go out there and I could sell my most expensive machine for $300,000 and I could get $50,000 for my lowest machine. And so there was market value there. And so if someone bought my little operation, they would have to put those assets on their books at full market value. Now, why is that actually good news? It's actually good news because then they can depreciate them all over again. You and I could sell a machine back and forth for 10 years, And for every 10 years, I'd sell it to you, you'd appreciate it down, you sell it back to me, I'd appreciate it down, I sell it back to you. We could just keep doing this until the machine wears out, and the government won't say anything about it. Now, there is something to be said here about capital gains versus the corporate tax rate. This whole argument works a whole lot better if the corporate tax rate is higher than the capital gains tax rate, because you're going to have, if you sell a company for more than you paid for it, you're going to have capital gains tax. But that is an argument that people can make, is that we're able to redepreciate these things all over again. Let's discuss something that you brought up earlier, and that is Elon Musk. Did you guys see that Elon Musk is going to be successful buying Twitter? Now, we know he's paying a premium. I think it's kind of a crazy premium. So this is actually a good deal for the Twitter shareholders. But we know that, first of all, the market value of Twitter before the offer was not only the fair market value of its assets, but it also had this brand thing on top of it. So there was other stuff. There's more value to the business than just the sum of the fair market value of the assets. And Elon's going to come in here, and not only is he paying full value for the company, he's paying more over and above that. I would bet that the market value, or fair market value of the assets of Twitter, is pretty darn small. And so what is Elon going to have to put on his books as a result of this purchase? Goodwill. Yeah, goodwill. You remember that intangible asset? Okay, so Elon puts a whole lot of goodwill on his books, and then let's say Twitter does something horribly, horribly wrong. I can't even imagine what it would be. But let's say that they come out and they are supporting killing pets, right? I mean, that's bad. I've got 2 dogs. That would just turn me off. What do you think happens then to the value of Twitter? What would Elon have to do to the value of the goodwill on his books? He's got to write it down, because that goodwill is no longer there. Does that make sense? Okay.
So did they really even have a choice whether or not to accept the offer? Like, because the shareholders are going to benefit so much from that?
Oh yeah. We see boards and CEOs all the time rejecting offers that would benefit the target shareholders. And all they have to do is make it hard enough that Elon gives up and goes away. Now in this case, they talked about the poison pill, right? I don't think they actually ever threw that out there, did they? It was a threat, but they never actually made it happen. But the whole idea is to get Elon to pay more for the company, which in theory benefits the target shareholders. Too often, though, this is just a way for managers and board members to protect their jobs. And we can see over and over again that there are failed acquisition attempts, even when there's a significant premium offered. And so, no, just because it's in the best interest of the shareholders doesn't necessarily mean it will go through. Yeah, people are scumbags. Okay, other questions? By the way, if you're a Twitter shareholder, you should be thrilled, right? Because you're going to get a bunch more money out of those shares than they were actually worth. Then let's talk about reduction in capital needs. And so you can have a target that has underutilized assets, and the bidder needs more capacity. And so if you put these together, we would require less capital than the 2 companies apart. Let's give an example here. And it used to be called Chrysler, and they keep changing their name. I think today the name is Stellantis. Who knows what it will be tomorrow? Do you guys know that? Chrysler is now called Stellantis. Stellantis sounds like some sort of heartburn medication, right? Ooh, Stellantis. Okay, so Stellantis, by the way, it's like a conglomerate of crappy car brands. Anybody in here drive a Fiat? My wife wanted a Fiat, one of those little Fiat 500s. I said, I can't afford to follow you around to pick you up every time that thing breaks down. Fiats just have a horrible reputation. Alfa Romeo, sexy, but they suck. They fall apart. Chryslers, we've discussed before. Okay, now, what does it mean when you have cars that not that many people want to buy, probably your factories are running under capacity. So let's say Stellantis plants are running at 60% capacity. But then there's this other company, they're headquartered in Korea, they're called Hyundai, and they make great cars at a great price. Now, are they the height of quality and luxury? No. Are they good enough? Absolutely they are. And are they priced fairly? Absolutely they are. In fact, they're priced a little on the low side. And so Hyundai, anytime they want to make more cars, they have to build a new factory. Now, Hyundai could actually go in and buy Stellantis, and then instead of building new factories to build their Hyundais, they could start building those Hyundais in those factories that they bought when they got Stellantis. Does that make sense? And so you could actually maybe benefit better doing that. Now, there is an argument against that, and that is cars are, people care what factory their car comes out of, right? So my car came out of Leipzig, Germany, and if I were a car snob, that would be important to me. They're going to start making the new version of my car in Mexico. Do you think some people might get upset by that? Yeah. And I remember when I was buying my wife's 1997 Plymouth Neon, which stank, by the way, there were two plants. There was one in Normal, Illinois, and there was one in Mexico. And basically, not knowing any better, I just went around the lot, and there were two identical ones. One was made in Illinois, one was made in Mexico. Well, I didn't know any better. I figured the one from Illinois was probably the better car because the people that put it together spoke the same language as me. Now, is there truth to that? Probably not, right? And in fact, the Audis coming out of Mexico are probably better quality than the ones made in Germany. But I digress. My point to you is this. Would people start looking at the Hyundais and saying, oh, wait a minute, that was made in a Stellantis plant? It's entirely possible. But what if we were making something like toothpaste? Does anyone look at the toothpaste tube and go, oh, well, that one came out of the Colgate factory. I don't want that one. No. And so there are arguments to do this outside of automobiles. Questions? Okay, so let's talk about avoiding mistakes. First of all, do not ignore market values. It's so amazing to me that managers of firms and their finance geeks think that they're able to spot underpriced assets in the market. That they would look at a company that is only currently worth $100 million in the stock market and say, oh, no, that's worth $200 million. Who's more likely to be right? One geek with a spreadsheet or millions of investors? Yeah, the investors. And so this is a horribly stupid idea to think that you're going to be able to go out there and find a firm that is undervalued by the market. Because if it were truly undervalued, other people would have already jumped in and started buying the shares and drove that share price up until it was no longer undervalued. So don't ignore the standalone market value of the firm. Secondly, you're only going to estimate incremental cash flows. And so if I buy a firm and I don't actually have any incremental gain from the merger, in other words, we don't find some of these things we've been looking at, these revenue enhancements, these cost reductions, if we don't find those things, then I haven't created any incremental cash flows. And too often what we see is people say, oh, well, it's going to boost our EPS from $1.50 to $2.16. Well, basically, you're just adding their earnings to your earnings and dividing by the new number of shares. Dumb, dumb, dumb. You're not actually creating any value. You're buying those earnings, right? You need to create new earnings. We should also use the correct discount rate. When I worked at Halliburton, we used, and I've told you this before, we used a single corporate average cost of capital of 11.9% for everything. And we went out and we were interested in this little Scottish company. It's kind of like a tech firm in the oil field. What they did, by the way, every oil well produces basically three things in different proportions. Number one, oil. Number two, natural gas. Do you know what the third one is? Salt water. Every oil well produces those three things. Now, Is oil valuable? Yeah. Is natural gas valuable? Yeah, if you can get it away from the wellhead. But what about that salt water? Can you just like pump it out on the ground? Can you just like eject that oily salt water into the ocean? No. So you have to deal with that water. And so ideally what you'd want to do is to maximize the production of oil and gas from a well while minimizing the production of the salt water. And that was the technology that these Scotsmen had invented. It was this valve that would sit down at the bottom, and it would, you could adjust it to try to tweak these levels of production of these three different things. And so the way it worked is it would send up a wire, it would send up the information on what's going on right now, and it'd go beep, 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 and bounce off a satellite, beep, 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 down to headquarters in Houston, Texas, where some geeks and geologists would come up with what were the proper adjustments, beep, 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 back to the oil well, and it would adjust. Now that was some amazing stuff. But do you think it was just as risky as our current business, or do you think it was more risky? I mean, we're used to making round things that get oil out of the ground, and now we're talking about geeks, satellites, right? This is a much riskier undertaking. So we're taking over this firm, and I asked, what discount rate are we using for that? And you know what the answer was? 11.9%. And then I actually got to meet some of these Scotsmen, like two of the founders. And I'm like, when you guys are thinking about projects, what kind of discount rate do you put on? And they're like, 25%. I'm like, 25%? They're like, oh, hell yeah, our stuff is really risky. What discount rate should we have been using to examine our acquisition of this Scottish firm? Theirs. After all, that asset that we're buying is that risky asset. We know, or at least they did, they knew how risky it was. We should have asked them, by the way, guys, what are you using for your discount rate? Now, does that necessarily mean that their discount rate's correct? No, but it would let us know that we certainly couldn't use our plain vanilla 11.9%. Does that make sense? So, always use the discount rate of the target. Always use the discount rate of the target. Always use the discount rate of the target when we are finding the present value of these incremental cash flows. And then finally, we need to be aware of transactions costs. So if any of you have ever bought or sold a house or a car, you know that the car's selling for $20,000. Can you get behind the wheel and head out on the road for $20,000? No. There's going to be taxes. There's going to be a title fee. There's going to be taxes. There's going to be all sorts of crap that you have to pay in addition to that $20,000. And so it would be foolish of you to do all your planning for that purchase based on $20,000. And yet we see people do that over and over again in these mergers. For example, right now, Elon's thinking $43 million is what he's paying for Twitter. Elon actually has, I think he's got an investment banker advising him, right? And then there's going to be a lot of lawyers and a lot of other stuff that they're going to have to deal with in order to make this thing happen. Plus, when we go out and make one of these deals, a lot of times we end up having to disclose additional information. By the way, if I am a CEO, do I want to disclose information about my firm? No. Competitors might be out there watching, right? And I might have to disclose something that would be of value to competitors in order to complete this transaction. And so that's another thing we need to keep in mind. Now, something to keep to note down here at the bottom. Replacing inefficient managers. That's actually a good rationale. If you can find a company that is ran badly, and you can take that company over and you can run it well, then you're going to have incremental cash flows, and that would be a good deal. But if you've read the hubris hypothesis at all, you know that managers overestimate their own abilities, and they tend to underestimate the value of other people's abilities. I'll give you an example. When I worked at Halliburton, we were taking over Dresser, And my boss calls me in and he says, I'm going to send you down there, and basically you're going to be teaching these people the Halliburton way because they're losers, they don't know what the heck they're doing, and you're going to share with them the gospel that is Halliburton. I said, yes, sir. And I went down, and by the way, when you show up somewhere new, the best thing to do for a while is keep your mouth shut and your eyes open and your ears open, right? And try to figure out what's going on. And so I did. And I got down there, and within like the first week, I figured out that these people had their crap together way better than we did, right? Part of the rationale for us taking them over was we were going to replace their loser managers. Well, it turns out their managers were not losers at all. And so any incremental cash flows that we thought we were going to get out of taking over that organization by replacing inefficient management, that just went away, right? So don't overestimate your ability to go in there and clean up a mess and make money as a result. Questions? Now, finally, we're going to get to the part where you get to use your calculator. I know you've been waiting for this moment. So please, if you don't have your calculator out, go ahead and get it out. And we're going to talk about, the first thing we're going to talk about is delta V. Delta V, what does delta mean, by the way? Change. And V is value, so we're talking about the change in value that results from the acquisition. The change in value that results from the acquisition. Now, what is V sub AB? V sub AB is the value of the merged companies. V sub AB is the value of the merged companies. V sub A is the standalone value of the bidding firm. V sub A is the standalone value of the bidding firm. And so we could multiply the number of shares, assuming that we're talking about all equity firms here, we could multiply the number of shares times the share price. That would give us the standalone value of A. And then B would be the target. And we could find the standalone value of B by taking the number of shares times the target share price. And so any value that is in this company after the merger minus those two standalone values, that is the change in value or the incremental gain. Now, it's only a gain if delta V is greater than 0. It's only a gain if delta V is greater than 0. If this thing is actually going to destroy value, you should run away from it. It's not a good project. We say if delta V is greater than 0, we call that synergy. Do you guys remember synergy from chapter 8, capital budgeting? When you have two projects that together, that one project raises the cash flows in the other. So we're looking here at putting two companies together, and we're going to raise the cash flows as a result of putting them together. Okay, now VB star. VB star is what the firm B is worth to firm A. And so firm A would be willing to pay up to the standalone value of firm B plus the entire incremental value of the firm. But if the bidder pays VB star, all the gain of the acquisition goes to the target shareholders. If the bidding company pays VB star, the entire gain of the acquisition goes to the target shareholders. And so we're going to define NPV as VB star minus the cost to the bidder to acquire the target. And so basically what we're looking at is VB star is that standalone value plus the incremental value minus whatever we have to spend to get it. And if that thing turns out positive, then our NPV is greater than 0. And what do we say about positive NPV projects? Yeah, you want to accept them. Okay. And so exactly the same here when we're doing acquisitions. We only want to accept positive NPV acquisitions. Okay. Now, if you're truly out there making a positive NPV acquisition, that has it's got this NPV greater than 0, what should happen to the bidder's share price upon announcement of the deal?
Could go up.
Yeah, it should go up. And so when they announce that they're taking over another firm, if the market thinks it's a positive NPV project, the share price of the bidder should go up. Recently, JetBlue. So let's talk about Spirit and Frontier. Have any of you ever flown Spirit Airlines? What, are they a great airline, like really high end? No, they're like a bargain basement kind of airline. Frontier Airlines, similar. They used to give you a chocolate chip cookie. I don't even think they do that anymore.
They do
Right?
have cool animals on the side of their plane now.
But they do have cool animals on the side of their plane. Very good. And Southwest occasionally paints a dolphin or a killer whale on theirs. Until, of course, we decided that we can no longer hold killer whales in captivity, and then they had to free those airplanes. Back to the story. Spirit Airlines and Frontier might be a match for each other. And if the bidders thought that that was, in fact, I can't remember what happened to Spirit's stock when they made the bid for Frontier or vice versa, but I can tell you this, JetBlue, is it like below average or above average? It's actually above average as far as the amenities that they provide, that sort of thing. So it's not a bargain basement airline. In fact, you could watch television on JetBlue long before you could watch it on other ones. In fact, a plane that was couldn't get its landing gear down, the people on the plane were watching CNN report on the fact that they couldn't land because their landing gear wasn't down. Talk about having to make an announcement to your cabin, like, folks, you probably already know from the TV, but we can't get our gear down. Okay, back to the story. When JetBlue announced that they were making a counteroffer for Frontier after Spirit had already made theirs, what do you think happened to JetBlue's share price? I'm pretty sure it went down. Number one, we know that Spirit was already probably overpaying for Frontier because they have to pay a premium. In order for JetBlue to be successful, what do they have to do? They've got to pay even more, right? And then the business models really don't mesh between JetBlue and Spirit. So you'll see in cases like that, if you make the announcement and your share price immediately goes down, it lets you know the market thinks it's a bad idea. Let's say that you're the CEO of the bidding firm and you say, oh yeah, we're going to go out and we're going to buy company X. And immediately your share price goes down. What should you do? Maybe not do that. And I think that's excellent. Now, we don't want to look stupid though, do we? No human does. Except for maybe that guy that does those Jackass movies. He seems to make a lot of money off looking stupid. But back to the story. What do? You say, we're going to do our due diligence. And you go in. What's due diligence?
Best you can.
Say again?
As best you can, or what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, you go in and you look at their books. And then, and by the way, are they actually going to like show you everything before you kind of preliminarily close the deal? No. And so you got to reach this agreement. But then you do your due diligence and you come back a week later and you're like, you know what? After we got a closer look at the books, we're going to walk away from this one. What immediately happens to your share price? Right? Do you think that happens very often? Rarely. Do CEOs like to confess that they're ever wrong? No, most humans don't, and CEOs have a higher level of self-esteem than most people in this room, right? Does that make sense? Questions? Okay, so let's do our example. We've got some basic information here. By the way, these are all 100% equity firms. We don't have to worry about the debt. And I will not make you worry about debt on exams because this stuff is complex enough without worrying about the debt. So here's our information. Firm A is currently selling for $20 a share, and there are 25 shares outstanding. Therefore, the standalone value of Firm A is 20 times 25, which is 500. Firm B is selling for $10 a share, and there are 10 shares outstanding. 10 times 10 is 100. Okay, now we estimate delta V is equal to $100. If you remember, delta V is that incremental value of the merger. Firm B's board will sell for $150. And you can think of that as being the $100 standalone value, which is $10 per share times 10 shares, and a merger premium of 50, because after all, we're paying 50 more than this firm is worth. So that's called the merger premium. By the way, that is a vocabulary kind of thing that will show up on the exam. And I may actually ask you to solve for the merger premium on something. So figure that out. That's the money over and above that we're paying. Now, merger premium could either be in total dollars. In this case, it would be 50, or it could be on a per share basis. What would our merger premium here be on a per share basis? How many shares are there in Firm B? 10. And our merger premium is 50 overall, so how much is it on a per share basis? 5, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Let's see, we already talked about that. Now, what about VB star? Remember we said that VB star is the standalone value of the firm plus the incremental value of the merger. And so we said the standalone value of Firm B was 100. That is just 10 times 10. And then this incremental value, that's, by the way, estimated, we'll get back to that, is 100. I add those together. It tells me VB star is 200. VB star here is 200. That means I could pay up to 200 for this company and be positive NPV. If I do 200 or over, now I'm into 0 or negative NPV territory, and it wouldn't be a good deal for the company. Okay, now let's talk about that delta V. Delta V is estimated by who? The bidder management or the target management? Who's buying the firm? Yeah, the bidder is buying the firm. They're the one that has to come up with their estimate of delta V. Do they have really good information about what's going on inside the target? No. Remember I told you when I wound up at the target and I saw things were not what we thought at all. So we don't know what's going on inside the target. And by the way, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know how these companies are actually going to mesh. I don't know truly what incremental cash flows there are. And so there's one thing I can tell you for sure. Delta V is not known with certainty. It's a swag. What does swag stand for? Yeah, scientific wild ass guess. But here's the problem. It's not really being made by scientists. So what you end up with are bidding managers. Basically, they will encourage their geeks to come up with a delta V high enough to justify the project. Why? Think back to, hopefully you've read the Huber's hypothesis. These people, by the way, are they acting in shareholder interest? No. Whose interest are they acting in? Their own. I want to buy that company. I'm going to buy that company, right? And we're going to make up data to support our decision to do that. And so this delta V is more often overestimated than underestimated. It's rare that delta V would be underestimated. Questions? Okay, now, there are two ways we're going to talk about paying for this. In truth, you could do a mixture of the two, but we're going to keep it simple. The first way is that Firm A pays $150 in cash for Firm B. And so the NPV would be equal to this VB star minus the cost to Firm A to acquire Firm B. And it's pretty clear here, when we're doing cash, that it's just $150. And so the NPV here would be 50, and so it's positive, so we would accept the project. So what is the value of the new firm? Well, since we're paying cash, the way we figure the value of the new firm is to take the standalone value of A plus the NPV. By the way, this NPV is from the perspective of the current shareholders of the bidding firm. The NPV is from the perspective of the current shareholders of the bidding firm. And after all, the job of the CEO is to maximize shareholder wealth. Is that CEO yet responsible for the shareholders of the target? No. Only responsible for the current shareholders of the bidder. Therefore, this NPV we look at is from the perspective of the bidding firm shareholders. And so all we have to do is take the standalone value of the bidding firm and add that net present value, and it tells us the new firm is going to be worth $550. Now, $550, and it was 25 shares outstanding. By the way, have we issued any new shares? No. And so we still got the original 25 shares, so now we are 550 divided by 25, and it tells us that our gain is $2 per share. Now, we could have also gotten that by taking our NPV and dividing by the number of shares, and it would tell us the per share gain. Any questions so far? Cash is the easiest way. Cash is the easiest way for us to do this calculation. When we do stock, it gets a lot hairier. So, in cash, oh, by the way, one more thing before we leave this. Remember that the standalone value of A plus the standalone value of B, 500 plus 100 plus delta V, another 100, that brings us to 700. How come the merged firm is only worth 550? Any ideas? What happened to that 150 that went missing? Who has that money now?
The target.
Yeah, the target shareholders. Those people, we gave them the money and they walked away. It's just like a lump sum divorce settlement, right? You just give that person the money, they walk away, you never talk to them again, unlike monthly alimony kind of thing, right? Okay, so that's why the standalone value in a cash deal is actually lower than the standalone value, or the post-merger value would be greater than the standalone values plus the incremental value of the merger. Now, in a stock merger, however, we've got the target shareholders are now going to become shareholders in the new firm. So, if no cash changes hands, that means that merged firm is now going to have the entire value. No money's leaving. So it's going to be the 500 plus the 100 plus the 100. It's going to be that full 700 because no cash went walking. Does that make sense? We issued shares instead of handing out cash. Now you say, wait a minute, why wouldn't I just use shares all the time? Well, let's talk about a couple of things that could happen here. Number one, shares, now you have to share the profits of the firm with more people. Does that make sense? Because now we've got more shares outstanding. The earnings have to be divided over more shares, so therefore EPS per share is lower than it would have been in a cash deal. Number two, we said that shares come with voting rights. What if before I had 50% plus one of the shares in the bidding firm, and then I go out and use stock to make an acquisition? Now it's possible that someone could buy up a majority of the shares in the new firm and basically boot me out. Does that make sense? I could lose control of the firm. And so there are a couple of reasons people might not want to do a stock acquisition. So how many shares did A issue to buy B? Well, we're going to give them $150 per share, or $150. It's $20 per share right now, which means we have to issue 7.5 shares. Now, don't freak out. Decimal shares are entirely possible. Decimal shares are entirely possible. I have some in my portfolio. You can buy decimal shares on Robinhood, though I don't recommend it. Lots of things you can do with decimal shares that students they miss out on. So don't let that freak you out. 7.5 shares. So now, how many shares are there for the acquiring firm? Well, there's the original 25 plus the new 7.5. And so we have 32.5 shares outstanding. By the way, what happens to the shares of the target firm in both cases?
Go away.
Yeah, they just totally go away, right? Okay, now, so what's the new share price? Well, we know the value of the firm is now 700. We're going to divide that by 32 and a half shares, and that tells us that our new per share price is $21.54. It's just easy math. 700 divided by 32 and a half gives us 21.54. What was the cost, therefore, to acquire B? Well, we had to give up 7.5 shares, and those shares are worth $21.54 apiece, which makes the cost to acquire $161.55. When we did cash, it only cost us $150. But here, we're having to give over stuff that's worth $161.55. As a result, when we calculate our NPV, we're going to come up with $38.45, which is lower than our original NPV. If you remember, when we paid cash, the NPV was how much? It's 200 minus 150? Yeah, it was just 50, right? And now we're down to 38.45. If we divide that 38.45 divide by the 25 original shares, it gives us $1.54. $20 original share price plus this $1.54. It agrees. And by the way, notice that we're dividing that 38.45 by the 25 original shares, not the 32 and a half. Why? Because remember, the NPV is always to the original bidding shareholders. The NPV always goes to the original bidding shareholders, and so there we are. Now when we do that, we can see that the new share price is $21.54, as opposed to it being $22 when we did cash. Now why is this the case? The answer is that the bidding shareholders now must share the gains of the merger with the target shareholders. Remember, previously, we kicked them out, right? They were no longer in the picture, but now they own 7.5 out of 32.5 of the shares. And so they are going to be getting some of the gains of this merger. We have to share. So, things to consider when we're choosing cash or stock. And the first one is the sharing question. Do people like to share good things? No. People are scumbags, right? And I can prove it to you. You're sitting there with your friends, there's only one piece of pizza left. Who do you think should get it? Me, right? That's how we all are, unless you're extraordinarily weird. That's how humans are. Now, if we're talking about a deal that's going to bring us a lot of money, do I want to share that with some strangers? No, I don't share it with anyone, but I'm bound by law to share it with my current shareholders. Okay, now, if I don't want to share good things, what does that mean about bad things like losses? Oh yeah. Have you ever heard the expression misery loves company? Yeah, if I can push some of these losses off on some other poor schmo, it's less loss that I have to deal with. Does that make sense? And so whenever I hear someone offering shares, the first thing I think is, maybe they think this is actually a bad deal. And the reason they're using their shares to pay for it is because they want to spread the losses over more than their current shareholder base. They want to make these other people suffer too. Does that make sense? Okay. Then there are taxes. So the first one is an argument for making cash purchases if there's going to be a gain, stock purchases if there's going to be a loss. Taxes, cash usually results in taxes. Who ends up having to pay the taxes? Target. Yeah, the target shareholders if they have a capital gain. And undoubtedly, or there are a lot of the Twitter shareholders who paid less than whatever Elon is offering now. There may be some who offered or paid more back in the day, but that's not the case if they're recent purchasers. And so those people are going to have to pay capital gains tax. I think it's a cash deal, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so cash usually results in taxes. And then finally there's control. And we've mentioned this previously. If you are just on the edge of controlling the firm and then you go out and make a a stock acquisition, you could lose control of the company. That never happens with cash acquisition. So which is more popular? Cash, it turns out. Now, when you see the big deals being made out there, the ones that really hit the newspapers, a lot of those have stocks in it. Some of them are an all-stock deal. But when you look at the overall number of acquisitions, the grand majority are cash. So, for instance, when Apple goes out to buy that chip design firm, that chip design firm is relatively small compared to Apple. And Apple sits on a boatload of cash. Do you think Apple's going to go to the good time and trouble to issue additional shares just to buy this tiny ladybug of a company? No, they're just going to write a check, right? And so a lot of these acquisitions, especially where it's a big company buying a very small company, it's just cash. In fact, sometimes, like at Apple, it would be considered petty cash, what they ended up paying for those people. Okay, now let's talk about signaling and the adverse selection problem. If I just stand up here and tell you, I'm a great teacher, should you believe me? No. Can I credibly, the first day of class, I walk in and I go, I'm a great teacher. Are you skeptical? You should be, because people are scumbags, right? So I could be lying to you. Do you think CEOs lie to people? Yeah. So if the CEO is telling you, oh yeah, this is a great deal and we're going to be making a lot of money out of this, we're going to do an all-stock offer. If you're going to do so well on this, why would you want to share it with other people, right? And so there's message number one, why a stock offer is a bad idea, because they're sending the signal that this is perhaps not as great as they're making it out to be. Number two, what does it say about the value of my stock if I'm willing to offer up stock instead of cash? Is my stock undervalued or overvalued? If my stock is undervalued, I want to pay cash because I don't want to use this undervalued stock to go out there and buy this. But what if I think my stock is overvalued? Oh yeah, I'm out there buying everything I can with stock, right? I'll give you an example. AOL. Have you guys heard of AOL before? It was like, this is back in the 90s, they were like the online internet company. That's who a lot of old people especially got their internet through. And as a result, they made some good money and their stock price was just through the roof during the dot-com boom. And what did they do? Well, like a lot of companies, when they end up with too much cash and too high of a valuation, they go out and they start looking for acquisitions. And one of the things they found was Time Warner. Time Warner does Time Magazine and Warner Cable and things like that, and Warner Brothers, the studios. Anyway, so AOL decided they were going to buy them. And AOL was saying, oh yeah, this is great because we can shove that Time Warner content through the AOL pipeline. It's a marriage made in heaven. By the way, those arguments are always stupid, right? Like when Verizon ended up buying some stuff and said, oh, it's going to, no, it doesn't work. Verizon, stick to your knitting. You're just a pipe. Back to the story. They go out and they buy Time Warner with a boatload of AOL stock. Why did they choose to use AOL stock instead of cash? Because they knew their stock was overvalued. And it was vastly overvalued because we were in the middle of the dot-com boom. And they knew it. And so they used their shares to buy Time Warner. Now, how does that story end? In the beginning, it's AOL Time Warner, and then AOL starts to shrivel like a raisin in the sun. It's like, right? Time Warner, solid old line company, kind of maintains its size, and so then the company became Time Warner AOL. And eventually, Time Warner spits out AOL, sells it to some, I think it was a private equity group. Anyway, the point here is when you see this kind of offer, number one, if it's so great, why are you offering shares? Why do you want to share that greatness? And number two, it may mean that your stock is overvalued. We call that adverse selection. when people have more information, when one party has more information than the other, and they make choices using that information that's going to disadvantage the other party. In this case, the bidding shareholder knows their stock is overvalued, and that's why they're going to offer it up. The target does not know that, but after this lecture they should, right? Okay, where do we usually see adverse selection? Anybody have any ideas? Where have you heard that term before? Did you guys have to take Insurance 211? Do you remember moral hazard and adverse selection?
I remember, yeah, a little bit about it.
Oh, if there's nothing else you remember from that class, it should be moral hazard and adverse selection. Let's talk about adverse selection. I woke up this morning. I had a bad cough, and I spit up some blood in the sink. Is that a good sign? No, trust the lady from the health department. That is not a good sign, right? Okay, now, instead of going straight to the doctor, what do you think I did? I Google, and I'm like, oh, crap. And then, instead of going to my doctor, I dropped by my insurance agent's office, and I try really hard not to cough while I'm there. And I'm like, hey, Vic, I was thinking about lifting my life insurance from, let's say, 1 million to 3 million. And he's like, okay, why? I'm like, it was back in 2006 when I bought that policy, and I'm just worth a boatload more now than I used to be. It could be true, it could be a lie, who knows, right? And so Vic, he's looking me over, and he's like, yeah, okay. And then I say, can I send you a check in the mail? And he's like, yeah, because we've been doing business for 15 years now. Anyway, then I go to the doctor. They're like, oh, damn, you need to go to the intensive care. He told me I have like 3 weeks to live. Do you think Vic would have made the enlargement on my life insurance policy if he'd known that I only had 3 weeks to live? And I can claim that I didn't have a diagnosis, can't I? Right? I had a buddy who got his wife pregnant we assume it was him. He got his wife pregnant right before he started his job with Halliburton. And he actually asked the guy that was kind of bringing us on board, he's like, I think my wife's pregnant. And the guy that's bringing us on board said, don't take her to the doctor until after your first day of work when your benefits kick in. Because it's the pregnancy starts on the day that it's diagnosed. Does that make sense? Now, was that guy acting in the best interest of the shareholders? No. So nobody acts in the... so back to the story. That's adverse selection. Any questions? So, this is where we left off last time. We're getting ready to talk about defensive actions. And you guys have actually seen some evidence lately of defensive actions. We'll get to that here in a second. But the target managers they've got tools to fight takeovers. And why do target managers want to fight takeovers? Does anyone remember? Yeah, they want to keep their job, because if they get taken over, there's a good chance they won't have a job anymore. Now, these defensive actions, we know that the bidder has to offer a premium, and so we know that accepting a bid would be a good deal for the target shareholders because they're going to get more than the shares are currently worth. But therefore, it sounds like defensive actions might be all bad because they're keeping this value gain from happening. The only time that we see them actually being of value to the target shareholders is when it allows the target to get a higher price per share. And so you'll often hear managers say that they're using these tools to get a better offer. And a lot of times they do. Now, let's give an example of when they don't. So there was a company called Yahoo. Are you familiar? Yeah. We used to, before Google, Yahoo was like the thing. But then Google came along, and now Yahoo's kind of an also-ran. The guy that started Yahoo, one of the two guys, was a guy named, I think his name is Andy Yang, and or Yang if you're Chinese. And he was the CEO at the time that Microsoft offered to buy Yahoo. Now, Microsoft is sitting on too much cash. They should have been distributing it to the shareholders. Instead, they're going to make a crummy acquisition, which is fairly normal for a company sitting on too much cash. And so they reach out. And what do you think Yang told him? Do you think he was all like, hey, yeah, that's a great idea? No! This guy is as rich as he needs to be, and he's got his baby, this company, which, by the way, he doesn't own a majority of the shares in, or he wouldn't even have to worry about this whole takeover thing. Well, anyway, so he kind of stiff arms Microsoft. They eventually go to make a tender offer to the shareholders, and they have to keep raising the amount of money they're offering because of Yang's defensive maneuvers. And if the story had ended with them selling Yahoo to Microsoft for this crazy premium, he would have been a hero to his shareholders. Instead, he stamped his feet like a 2-year-old and said, "I will never sell. We will never do this." And he kept lying to the shareholders, telling them how Yahoo was better off by itself. And so he is a perfect example of how these things don't always help the target shareholders. They only help if the deal actually goes through. Questions? Okay, let's talk about some of these defensive tools. First of all, the corporate charter. The corporate charter sets the rules for decision making at the company. And it's written before the company ever goes public. And of course, it can be amended after the company goes public. But some things that you'll see in there that help to prevent mergers are these supermajority requirements, like we talked about earlier. Greater than or equal to 2/3 of the shares must vote in favor of selling the company. And so that would be a supermajority requirement. And then they have what are called classified boards or staggered boards. And this is where every year, let's say there are 12 people on the board. Every year, 2 people stand for election, and that means that and they have 6-year terms. So it's kind of like the Senate. Do you guys know how the Senate works? Only 1/3 of them gets elected every 2 years. You guys know about that? The House turns over every 2 years, right? 100%. But the Senate's more like a classified board where only 1/3 of it turns over every year. And so what that means is if you want to take over the company and you're planning to do it with the shares that you bought, you're going to go through these elections, and let's say we can only elect 2 people this time, and we can only elect 2 people next time, and it may take a while for us to be able to get enough people on the board to actually sway what's going on at the company. And so a classified board is another way that these people can defend against being acquired. Any questions? So let's talk about repurchase and standstill agreements. And in fact, the slide should start with targeted repurchase, because that's what happens first. And then we have the standstill agreement. Let's talk about how this works. And I'm going to walk you through an example. There was a guy named Gold something or other, a British guy. And he had, I think it was Goldman Sachs, on the lookout for companies that he could take over, break apart, and make a lot of money. And Goldman Sachs came to him with Goodyear. Goodyear at the time, by the way, what's Goodyear known for? Tires. And by the way, that's what Goodyear's good at. But the problem is that these firms, over time, if they're good at something and they collect a lot of cash, if they don't pay it out to shareholders or do repurchases of shares from the shareholders, then they end up sitting on too much cash. And then they end up doing stupid things with the cash. And so let's talk about some of the stupid things that Goodyear did. Number one, they got into manufacturing athletic footwear. What does athletic footwear have to do with tires? Well, they're like tires for your feet, right? And they have rubber in them. That's about the only thing that you could really link these up with. So they do that. Now, by the way, do you guys remember Goodyear footwear? No. Okay, so obviously it's not all that great. It's not like the next Nike. Now, what else did they do? Well, it turns out during World War II, the government asked a lot of people to make a lot of different weird stuff. Smith Corona, the typewriter people, were making M1 carbines, short rifle. And Goodyear was asked to make airplanes. And Goodyear said, well, we did have that blimp thing, and they had a huge hangar in Akron, Ohio that they could set up to manufacture Corsairs for the Navy and the Marine Corps. And so they did that during the war. Now, after the war, these other people had the good common sense to go back to their regular line of business. Smith Corona went back to making typewriters. IBM went back to making tabulating machines, as they were called then, computers, what we call them now. But Goodyear said, oh, wait, we should start an aerospace division, because space was something people were starting to talk about. So they start this aerospace division, and they end up making parts for airplanes and satellites and all sorts of crazy stuff that had nothing to do with tires. And then they were also just wasting money generally on all sorts of wasteful spending. So along comes, oh, and by the way, one thing that makes you an attractive takeover target, a lot of cash. Let me ask you this. Would you prefer marrying someone who had $100,000 in the bank or someone that was $100,000 in debt? In the bank, right? Now, you don't have to feel like a scumbag for thinking that. I mean, love is love, but you really, my wife came to me debt-free. My father-in-law paid off her $300 of credit card debt the day before a wedding, and I'm forever grateful that he did so. Now, you definitely would like to have a company with cash, and one of the things that taking over that company does is gives you access to that cash. And so Goodyear is sitting on a boatload of cash, and they've got all these wasteful ventures going on, and that makes them a huge, inviting, juicy target for this takeover artist. Back then we called them corporate raiders. Today we refer to them as activist investors. Corporate raider just sounds so much sexier, like a pirate. Back to the story. So he, by the way, starts buying up shares of Goodyear. Do you think he's made any announcement what he's trying to do? No. What's going to start happening to the share price as soon as the market knows what he's up to? Yeah, it's going to go up. So what he does is he buys up to 4.999999% of the outstanding Goodyear shares. Why 4.999999%? Because when you roll over, on the day you roll over 5%, you have to report to the SEC that you have this ownership stake and what your intentions are with the company. And so what does he do? He runs up to 4.999%, and then on the very last day, he makes a push to buy as many shares as he possibly can, because at the end of that day, he's going to have to make an announcement of what he's up to. Does that make sense? And so he makes a big push. Let's say that now he's owning 10% of the firm. Well, now he makes the announcement of what he's trying to do. And of course, do you think the people at Goodyear are happy about that? No. And so they immediately start a public smear campaign against this guy. Like, this dirty limey, by the way, that's slang for a British person. This dirty limey is going to come in here, take your jobs, and do all sorts of horrible things. And he's just basically going to suck the money out of the company and leave. And so they do this public relations thing, and in fact, at one point, they were encouraging children, everyone in Akron, by the way, everyone in Akron, which is where the company was located, everyone in Akron was doing what they could to try to save Goodyear. The managers were like, buy up all the Goodyear stock that you can, because it'll keep it out of the hands of this horrible, horrible person. Now, kids were collecting their lunch money, their milk money and whatnot, trying to buy as many shares as Goodyear's as possible. What do you think started happening to the price of Goodyear shares?
It went up.
Yeah, they went up. Now, here's the fun thing. What do you think the managers were doing with their own shares?
Selling it.
Yeah, they're selling them because this is the highest share price they'd ever seen, right? These are the same scumbags that are telling the locals to buy as many shares as they could. People are scumbags. Okay, so then eventually what happens is they invite this guy to come for a negotiation. And what they ended up telling him was that they were going to do a targeted repurchase. And that's where they buy the stock back from this corporate raider, this bidder, and they're going to buy it at a substantial premium. So let's say that he had paid between $10 and $15 for all of his shares. They'll offer him 25 if he'll just take that money. And then the other thing is he has to promise to a standstill agreement. And the standstill agreement says, I will leave you alone for 5 years, 10 years. By the way, if the CEO is 61, do you think a 5-year window would work? Yeah, he's going to retire at 65, right? A lot of these people have mandatory retirements at 65 or whatever. And so basically, it's the CEO will negotiate that standstill agreement to be in place long enough that they can have their sweet, sweet retirement, because people are scumbags. Okay, now let's talk about where the money comes from for doing a targeted repurchase. Remember, the company's sitting on a boatload of cash. Whose cash is it? Yeah, the shareholders. And the shareholders now are paying this guy a premium for his shares. Now, does everybody get to make this sweet, sweet deal? Do you think this offer of $25 a share is open to just everybody? No! It's only open to the person who has the ability to take over the firm. So that's why it's called a targeted repurchase. We just want to get this person's shares. This is actually called green mail. Green mail, because we're basically paying this person to go away. By the way, what is blackmail? Very good. So you've got information about someone, perhaps embarrassing pictures of them in a compromising position with exotic animals, who knows? But you got something that they just don't want to get out. And so what do? You call them up and you say, hey, I've got these pictures of you with let's say it's a lynx. I've got these pictures of you with a lynx. And I'm pretty sure you don't want everyone to see these. Oh, yeah, what do you want? Well, it's money, right? Usually money. Okay, now here's the question. If anyone's ever blackmailing you, you basically have two options for putting a stop to this. Because if you just pay them, what's going to happen? Yeah, they'll keep coming back for more. Every case that we've seen of this, that we know about, they just keep coming back for more. So there's really only two ways out of it. What are they? Kill them. I'm not kidding. That puts an end to it real quick. However, it's illegal. What's the more preferred method? Oh, no, you're still thinking about killing them, right? By the way, ladies and gentlemen, hitmen that you can just hire don't exist. It's always an undercover officer. So if you're going to do this sort of thing, you either got to do it yourself or you just got to put that behind you, right? You just got to let it go. And I recommend letting it go. Right? Okay. Now, if you're not going to kill them, what do you have to do?
You make them give you your stuff back.
How do you do that? Yeah, exactly.
Blackmail them back.
Blackmail them back. Ooh, I like that. Mutual assured destruction. However, this person has never been anywhere near a farm animal, or they haven't done anything that would, yeah. By the way, it's usually really embarrassing stuff. So let's talk about the correct way to handle blackmail. This is just helpful information. It won't be on the exam. You confess. You come out. So my favorite example, David Letterman. Do you know who that was? Late night TV show host. And someone contacted him and said, I have pictures of you and your secretary doing it on the desk. And that night, Letterman went on, first of all, he called the FBI. And then that night he goes on stage and he says, basically he just tells a story. He says, I have something really embarrassing to tell you. He says, and it's far more embarrassing for my secretary because now everyone knows that she had sex with me, right? And he just put it out there. Did the person have anything left to hold over him? No. Could they keep coming back? No. Did it cost Letterman his marriage? I don't know. Who knows? But you guys could Google and find out. But the trick is, it did put an end to the blackmail. Now, back to green mail. Green mail, we're going to pay this person off. The money is coming from the minority shareholders. So the other shareholders are getting soaked to pay this guy to go away. Is that in the interest of maximizing shareholder wealth? Absolutely not. It's exactly the opposite. The company would be so much better, or the shareholders would be so much better if the company just went ahead and sold to the bidder, because then people would get a premium to the current value of their shares. Now, the Goodyear story does have sort of a happy ending. Once they paid this guy to go away, they were in such bad shape financially that they had to get rid of the sneaker division, get rid of the aerospace division, and stop wasting money. So at least there was a slight positive out of all that. Question?
Did you take legal action if he did something like that? It's not in the best interest.
Oh yeah, so you can, in fact, there are shareholder suits against directors and officers all the time. In fact, Elon Musk I think they just finished up and said that he didn't do anything wrong with the Solar City acquisition at Tesla. And so the shareholders can sue. But here's the trick. Who are they suing? Yeah, it's unless the person has a lot of their own wealth that you can tap, probably not going to do you a whole lot of good. But it makes you feel better, right? Good question. Other questions? Okay. Now let's talk about poison pills. Financial device designed to make it impossible for a firm to be acquired without managerial consent unless the acquirer is willing to commit financial suicide. So, how would this device be set up? In our example, let's say that the person had acquired 10% of the shares, and they had done so over the last 3 months. What would the poison pill look like? Well, we would give all shareholders of record as of 4 months ago the right to buy 10 more shares at a highly reduced price. And so you're going to sell these discounted shares to everyone except for the person who's trying to build this position. Does that make sense? And so now they thought that they had 10% of the firm. Now they actually have far, far less. And this is what they were threatening to do, Twitter was threatening to do, to try to keep Elon Musk from taking them over. Now, to me, a poison pill, and another thing you could do is to pay out all the cash that you have on. Actually, go ahead and borrow some money, then pay out all the cash on hand to your shareholders as a dividend, and now you've gone from being the company with a lot of money on hand to being one that's in a lot of debt. Now, is that good for the target firm long term? No. And in that case, what it sounds like to me is like these people who someone breaks up with them and they say, well, if I can't have her, no one can. And then it doesn't make any sense, right? So they're not acting in the best interest, once again, of the shareholders. So the poison pill is the idea is we're going to make us taste really bad to anyone that's going to try to consume us. Actually, I described the share rights plan first, and then the poison pill was the second part. But the idea of both of these things is basically just, what we say is the intention is to force negotiation. What are we going to negotiate about? What's the only thing we're really concerned about, or should be, if we are doing the goal of financial management? Maximize shareholder wealth. So the only thing we're going to really negotiate with these people about is the price that they're paying, right? And so we can use these defenses against takeover to try to get the price up, and at that point, then these things can be rescinded by the target. For example, that poison pill threat. Did Twitter go ahead and pull the trigger on that? No. They were just using it as a negotiating tactic. Questions? Okay. Now we've talked about earlier about going private and leveraged buyouts. Usually managers are involved. And for the managers, this is actually a takeover defense. But to the shareholders, it's actually an acquisition in and of itself because the managers are now buying their shares. Do you think the shareholders really care who they sell their shares to? No. And so to them, it's exactly like a takeover, as if a corporate raider had come in. But to the managers, it's actually a defense against takeover. Now that Elon Musk owns, let's assume the deal is already done and everything's signed off. Will anyone be able to take over Twitter? No shares out there that could be bought. Questions? Now let's talk about divestitures and restructuring. So a divestiture is when you sell assets. And it could be just individual assets, it could be certain operations, entire divisions, and we're going to sell those to someone outside the firm, to a third party, so not to our current shareholders, and we'll sell them outside of the firm. Now, why would we have to do that? Well, after a merger, a lot of times we have to sell those to avoid antitrust problems. So back in the day, we had two big oil companies, Exxon and Mobil, and they wanted to merge. But it turns out that on long stretches of interstate highway, the only two stations at any given exit were Exxon and Mobil. Now, what do you think would happen if we allowed Exxon and Mobil to merge and allowed them to keep both those stations? What would happen to the price of gas at that exit? It goes up. And so the consumer protection argument for antitrust kicks in, and the U.S. government says we're only going to allow you guys to merge if you sell, and they identify all those exits, if you sell one of the gas stations at all of these exits. And so that's exactly what they did. In fact, there's a refining company out of San Antonio, Texas called Valero. And Valero actually went out and bought those stations from Exxon and Mobil, so now there would be competition. So for Exxon and Mobil, it was a divestiture, but for Valero, who previously didn't have any gas stations, what kind of acquisition was it? Horizontal, vertical, or conglomerate? Yeah, it's vertical, right? Because previously they didn't have gas stations. They were a refining company. Now they have an outlet for these gas stations. So if you're in the Southwest and you see Valero stations, now you know why they exist. Okay, so that's the number one reason. Number two, raise cash to pay for the deal. A lot of times, especially if we are doing a cash offer, we go out and raise that by selling a bunch of debt. And in fact, that debt may be junk bonds. In other words, high yield kind of debt that we really would like to pay off as quickly as we possibly can. And so one of the reasons we're going to sell assets is to pay down that debt and therefore reduce our interest cost. And then finally, just to get rid of unwanted assets. When I was working that deal with Halliburton and Dresser, there were core assets that we wanted, but then there were some things that didn't really fit with the rest of our operations. For instance, Waukesha compressors. Waukesha compressors sit on natural gas pipelines, and they compress it so it can keep moving down the pipeline, and we had no interest in doing that. It didn't fit with any of the rest of our business. And so we took the Waukesha compressors and some other things, and we bundled them into a nice tidy package, and we sold it to a private equity firm. And so we got rid of those unwanted assets. And by the way, two birds with one stone, what did that also give us? It gave us cash to help pay for the deal. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's see here. So let's talk about the different kinds of divestitures. So first there's the equity carve-out. And that's where we've got these undesirable assets. We put them into a completely separate company, and then and it's totally owned in the beginning by the parent, of course, but then we do an IPO for part of the shares. And what that does is it puts enough out there that the market now places a fair value on that. Then down the road, if we want to sell the remaining shares, we actually know basically what to ask for them. By the way, do you think most companies know what the true market value is of a division or an operation? No. Unless it's the only division or operation at the company, they really don't know what something's worth. But if I spin this off into a little ball, or if I carve it out into a little ball and then I sell 10% of it, now what I know is the value of the rest of that ball, so then I know what to ask for it if I'm going to sell it to private equity, or I could just go ahead and keep issuing shares until it was all gone, until I had no more shares to sell. Does that make sense? Okay, now the equity carve-out, it can end up in an IPO like this, or we could take that part that we carved out and do what's called a spin-off, and just give shares to our current shareholders in the part that's carved out. And so it would be like this: if you own 10% of Ford Motor Company, and then Ford Motor Company decides to do a carve out and spin off its electric vehicle operations, which people are making an argument they should do, you would get 10% of the shares in that new electric vehicle company. You would get 10% of the shares in that new company because you own 10% of the shares in the original company. That's what pro rata means. If you own 1%, you get 1%. Now, what do you think the argument is? What do you think the argument is for Ford carving out and spinning off the electric vehicle operation? Do you think that piece would have a higher valuation if it wasn't shackled to the rest of Ford? Yeah. If you look at electric vehicle companies on the market today, they get much higher valuations than traditional companies. And so it might be a benefit to the shareholders of Ford for them to have shares in Ford and also in this new electric vehicle company, because it would then get fairly valued by the market. Does that make sense? Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
But isn't Ford using their money from their gas and diesel to pay for their electric?
You know, that's a good question. Of course they are,
Yeah.
right? Because they're bringing in profits from their regular vehicles to invest in the new vehicles. But the question is this: could they get money otherwise? If we spun that electric vehicle thing out, would people be willing to put money into it? And I think the answer is clearly yes, based on what we're seeing with Tesla, Lucent, and all those other folks. And by the way, if you can't attract money for a division on its own, should you be soaking your own money into it? No. We call that subsidizing underperforming divisions. And it's something we do here at the university, if you dig into the numbers. By the way, College of Business, we're rock stars, knocking it out of the park. There are other colleges, not so much. And so we end up subsidizing these underperforming divisions. If we were a corporation, we might be thinking about doing some sort of to send those packing. But of course, we're not, right? Questions? Okay, now let's talk about the split up. So this is where you've got shareholders in the original company, and the company breaks into many pieces, and everybody gets a pro rata proportion of all the companies that are born out of it. So if you own 10% of the big company, now you're going to own 10% of a bunch of little different companies. And so our favorite example of this goes back to 1984. If you go back prior to 1984, we basically had one phone company in this country. Do you remember those days? Yeah. We had one phone company. It was all AT&T, and they had what they called the bells, the baby bells underneath them. And we were Southwestern Bell around here. And what happened is that building out the infrastructure for telephones was such an expensive undertaking that AT&T basically convinced the U.S. government that the only way that they could afford to do it was if they were a monopoly, because then they could charge monopoly prices, but they agreed to be regulated. So they said, oh, you guys can tell us if we're charging too much, right? Now, does anyone know what the true value is of a phone call at that time? No. And so basically, if I'm AT&T, what I do is I say, we want $12. And what's the regulator going to say? You only get 10, right? I know I could have made it on 6, right? But there's no competition, nothing to hold me in check other than this regulator who might or might not be doing a good job. Roll forward to 1984. It finally comes around that the United States says, look, it's gone on too long. we need to do something about it. And so the remedy was to break up the AT&T. And the way they broke it up was AT&T remained the long distance company, and then all of the regional bells became their own companies. I think there were like 12 of them. Now, I'll give you an example. When I was a kid, my best friend lived one half of a town away, but they were on a different exchange. And so in order to talk to him on the phone, it would cost something like 15 cents a minute. Guy lives like 12 miles away. And so when I would want to talk to him, I would have to ask permission and beg profusely to get my mom to let me call him. By the way, how much does it cost now to call from California to New York? Let's assume you've got a cell phone. No incremental cost, right? And the reason that we've got that is because we broke apart this big monopoly back in the day. If we didn't, we would still be paying exorbitantly high prices per minute. I've called from one continent to another for less than 15 cents a minute. So it really did do the trick. Questions? Who have they been talking about splitting up lately? You guys don't watch the news nearly enough or read the Wall Street Journal. Congress is really upset about a couple of big companies, 2 or 3. Anybody know?
Amazon?
Amazon's one of them, right? Amazon, people are like, Amazon's too big, Amazon's taking advantage of us. Well, they may well be taking advantage of us, right? So that's one of them they're talking about breaking apart. Google would be another one. Facebook is another one. Now, do I think those are like on the edge of happening? Absolutely not. But those are things, if that's going to happen, it's going to happen during your lifetime, and you'll get to see one of these split ups too. Now, I will tell you this, it was interesting to see what happened with the stock prices of when all those things busted apart, the parts turned out to be worth more than the whole. Individual parts were worth more than the whole. And we see that a lot. When people bust apart a conglomerate, then the individual pieces actually end up, if you sum the values of them, then they end up being worth more than the conglomerate. We call that the conglomerate discount. And so these split ups actually can be a good deal for not only for consumers, but also for shareholders. Questions? And that is the end of chapter 21. So now we are on to the hubris hypothesis. The hubris hypothesis. So I went ahead and put the answer on this one because no one ever gets it. And that is, what's the central prediction? By the way, raise your hand if you actually read the paper. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so I guess you guys are going to have to carry the conversation here. So sad. Okay, so what's the central prediction? That the total takeover gain to the target bidding firm shareholders is non-positive. What does non-positive mean? 0 or less, right? And so he's not saying it's necessarily negative. It could be 0, but it's definitely not positive. Now, he's combining the takeover gain to both the target shareholders and the bidder shareholders. Now, we've already discussed that the target shareholders are going to be getting that premium. It's possible that they'll have a gain from the merger and that the bidders will have a loss. But what he's saying is when you add those two things together, more often than not, it does not create value for anybody. It doesn't create value, in the overall. Okay. So, hubris. If you bother to look it up, you'll know that it's excessive self-pride or arrogance. Now, in the hubris hypothesis, what group of people are afflicted with hubris? Yeah, the managers of the bidding company. And they're basically saying, we're so smart, we know that this firm is more valuable than the market thinks it is. There's strike number one. We know we can be better managers of this firm than the current management. There's another sign of hubris. And so these are the kinds of things that are driving these bidding managers to make these offers. Now, Richard Roll, the guy that wrote the article, he said that there's a reason that managers don't learn from their mistakes on mergers and acquisitions and don't get disabused of this hubris. Why is it? If you'd read the article, oh my goodness, folks. How many times have I asked you to read that thing? Mr. Zach, how many times have I asked you to read that? Too many. And did you read it? No. So let me tell you about how to read an academic paper if you just really don't want to read it. You start by reading the abstract, you read the introduction, you browse through the tables, and you read the conclusions. And that will at least allow you to fake your way through one of these conversations instead of embarrassing yourself as you are now. Back to the story. Roll says that people only get a chance to do 2 or 3 of these in a lifetime. And so after the first one, you might say, oh, that was just bad luck, right? Or, oh, the market changed, or this, that, and the other. And these people will make excuses, and therefore, because they have so few opportunities to do this over time, they really never learn from it, and they never get disabused of this whole hubris problem. So, let's ask Ms. Hep. If you only played one basketball game and you lost, would you assume you were a bad team? Oh, you would. You're an honest person. Most people were like, no, the ref was against us. They'll make up excuses, right? What does it take to prove to most people that their basketball team is bad? A multiple series of losses. How many games in a season?
Over 30.
Over 30. You would have the opportunity over the course of a season to learn that you are either a good basketball team or a bad basketball team. Could you really find out if you were only going to do 3 games over your entire career? Absolutely not. And so that's the problem here. So these people never get knocked off their perch. By the way, do you think hubris is common among CEOs? Does it take a certain amount of arrogance to think that you're the right person to lead a multi-billion-dollar enterprise? Absolutely. What about surgeons? Do you think surgeons are a little bit arrogant? Yeah, you got to be arrogant to cut into another human being. Do you think professors? Yeah, you got to be a little arrogant to think that you know enough that you should stand in front of other people and tell them stuff, right? And so we see this. This is a character trait with a lot of these folks. And so it shouldn't surprise us at all that we see this. So, we've already talked about that. Let's talk about this overestimating and underestimating the value of the potential firm. Remember, the first step in all this is we're looking at the target. We need to figure out what is that thing truly worth on its own. And what Richard Roll is saying is that the current market value, this is the current stock price, he says that's our very best guess for what the value of this company actually is. And that all these guesses that these managers come up with are basically a normal distribution about that expected value. By the way, it's just normal distribution on its side. The camera's not even picking up on my lovely normal distribution. Wake up! There you go. Okay, so what he's saying is that, and by the way, the true value we think is the stock price. So we've got guesses here that are too high for the value of the target, and we've got guesses here that are too low. And he says, folks, we're not even gonna, we don't ever see these guesses that are too low, because if the stock's currently worth $12 a share and you only think it's worth 10, are you gonna make an offer? No. And so he says, we totally don't see this. All we see are these overestimations. And so he's saying roughly half of the estimations out there are going to be too high, and they might precipitate some sort of offer. Does that make sense? Okay, so the hubris hypothesis predicts that if there's an announcement of an unanticipated bid, that the bid of the target share, or the price of the target share should go up. What happened to Twitter's share price when Elon Musk's unannounced bid suddenly becomes announced? What do you think happened? Yeah, it had to go up, right? Now, what if all that had just died off and Elon had walked away and no one else was there bidding for Twitter? Roll says what happens is that the stock price returns back to its pre-bid level. The stock price goes back to its pre-bid level. In other words, no new information was released by that bid. The bidding managers didn't have secret magical information that the rest of us don't have. So they didn't release any new fantastical information that would increase the value of the firm. The only thing that made the stock price go up was the very fact that someone was offering a premium. As soon as that premium potential goes away, it goes right back to where it was. And in the case of Yahoo, it actually was worse than that. Because let's say it started out at $20 when Microsoft starts making its offers, and then the share price goes up, and as soon as Jerry makes it, Jerry was his name, not Andy, as soon as Jerry makes it clear that he's not going to play ball, then you would expect the stock price to fall back to 20. But it actually fell lower than that because there was new bad information that was released as a result of this whole thing. And that bad information was Jerry Yang is never going to sell. Beforehand, Yahoo was only worth $17 a share, but people were buying it for 20 on the assumption that someone would take it over and that there would be an even bigger premium. But after Jerry says no and stamps his feet, then we know that's not going to happen, and Yahoo shares actually fell down below their prior level. So there was new information released, but just not the kind that the bidder thought. Okay, and the evidence is consistent with both of these predictions. By the way, does Roll do his own examination of the data, or where does he get his, does he cite other studies, or is he creating his own data panels? Yeah, he cites other studies, and so this isn't just something that Roll cooked up in his kitchen. He's looking at all these other studies, and he's saying, look, the data is, it all looks in the same direction, with a few exceptions. By the way, I actually met Richard Roll when I was a doctoral student, and he had a 26-year-old girlfriend. And at the time, he's in his 60s. Only sexy finance professional on the planet, apparently. Okay. So, we talked about that. So we already talked about this, so I'm going to skip over that. So, why might a bidder's share price drop upon announcement of a bid? No, that's fine.
It's just, it says it's their rational, because they'll realize if there's like a care the reason.
Say that again?
That if they're rational, like, they will have errors if they repeat it.
Okay, so we're talking about a bidder and their share price, and they've just announced they're trying to take over another company. What might cause their share price to go down? Let me ask this another way. If the market thinks this is a great idea, will the share price of the bidder go up or down? It's going to go up, right? And so if the bidder's share price goes down, what does this mean the market overall thinks about the offer? It's a bad deal, right? It's at least a bad deal for the bidding shareholders. It means that the bidder is overpaying for the target. It means that the NPV of this acquisition to the bidder, the market says it's negative. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here. By the way, the delta, how do we get into the situation? Remember we talked about delta V and the overestimation. The bidding managers tend to overestimate the incremental value of the merger because they're afflicted by hubris. And by the way, they want the deal to go through. And so they're willing to kind of inflate those incremental value expectations. So what might happen? So even if it's a bad idea, a negative NPV, it's still possible that the bidder's share price will go up on the announcement of the offer. And it's because the offer may contain more information other than just the bidder's desire to acquire the target and the price. It might say something about the bidder's thoughts on their future earnings. And so if the bidder is out there offering cash and lots of it, then, and they're doing it, they're taking on debt to do that, they're pretty sure they're going to be able to cover those coupons. And so this might be information that the expected future cash flows of the bidder are actually higher than we thought. And so it might not be that the good news is that they're buying this other firm. It might be the good news is that they've got lots of money, more than we thought. So I'll roll back. I used to drive a 2001 Nissan Sentra. I think I've told you about her before. And it was 2012 before I finally got rid of that car. Let's say that a student saw me on my last day with my Nissan Sentra. What do you think they would assume about my level of wealth?
You're kind of poor.
Yeah, they would assume that I'm kind of poor, right? And, and as far as all the people that I knew, they would think the same thing, right? But then I trade that car in, and I show up in a brand new Porsche 911. Does that change your estimate of my personal wealth? You say, nice car, Dr. Haggard. I say, thanks. Bless you. I paid cash. Now, what have I further done to your expectation of my wealth? Oh, yeah. Damn, he must have it going on, right? That YouTube channel must be paying off big time for him. Okay, so that'd be new information to you. It would raise your estimate of my thoughts on my future earning and my current wealth. And that's exactly what could be going on here. Even if this is a bad idea, the bidding share price can still go up. Now, here's what happens, though. As we get closer and closer to the deal coming to fruition, that bidder share price is going to start to go down to reflect that negative NPV. Because what we're looking at is the difference between, let's say, at the end of the day after the announcement, and then when they finally close the deal, you'll see all that negative value get worked into it. By the way, the probability of the deal closing is low in the beginning and gets higher the closer you get, right? And so if in the beginning we think it's a low probability that they'll actually complete this bad deal, then we might not drop their share value all that much. And this good news about the earnings might be enough to make that share price actually go up instead of going down. But as it becomes more and more clear that they are dedicated to this monumentally stupid idea, then we start to see the full loss get worked into the bidder share price. Questions? And we already just talked about that. So, why might a cash offer for a target generate a higher bidder announcement return than a stock offering? Well, we just talked about the earnings expectation. So if you thought that you were going to have good earnings, wouldn't you rather pay cash? By the way, if I offer new shares, I have to share the gains with other people, right? Do we like to share good things? No. If I offer shares, I have to share. If I offer cash, I don't have to do that. So if I can do cash, I'm probably going to do that. Also, we mentioned that if they offer their shares, what does it probably say they think about their own shares?
Overvalued.
Yeah, they're overvalued. And so now not only do we have that they're jumping into this stinker of a deal, we also have that they probably think their shares are overvalued. And as a result, we might end up with the share price going down more if they're doing a stock offering. I've already told you about AOL and Time Warner. Any questions? This one's kind of funky. Why might bond prices of bidders in cash deals drop upon announcement of a cash offer? And in order to understand this one, you have to think through a chain of stuff. So, if the company offers cash for the firm and it gets accepted, what happens to their cash balance? If you write a check for something, what happens to the balance in your checking account? It goes down. Now, does that make it more likely or less likely that you'll be able to pay your next credit card bill? It makes it less likely. As a result, it is riskier. And we say that risk and return have to go together. And so when the firm pays out a bunch of cash, it makes it less likely that they're going to be able to make their bond payments. Those bonds become riskier. They end up with a higher yield to maturity. Now, what happens to bond prices as yield to maturities rise? Oh, come on. You guys remember from chapter 5? Yeah, when bond prices go down when yield to maturities go up. And so that's why we might see the bond prices of bidders drop after they announce a cash offer. We would not expect to see the same thing with a stock offer because it's not impacting their cash position. And that is the end of the hubris hypothesis.